Hello and welcome to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast.
Today, our special guest is Peter Gruenbaum. So, Peter, welcome to the show. I guess you are an energy software engineer at SDK Bridge, and most importantly to me, you are an instructor on HeatSpring, which is a super awesome platform for people like us. So, welcome, and how are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good. I'm almost seeing rainbows.
All right. We have some unusual sun here in Seattle, which is where I am.
Okay, great. Yeah, I remember one time hearing about Seattle. This was quite a while ago, like 15 years ago, that somebody was saying that they get more solar energy on cloudy days or times when you don't see direct sunlight than they do when you do have direct sunlight. So that's kind of interesting. I don't know if that was a myth or if that was true, but because you just don't get a whole lot of energy when you don't have direct sunlight. But hey, you do get energy when it is overcast, and Seattle is very famous for being overcast and for having fog and coffee.
Yes.
Computers.
That's right.
Yeah. And so you're up there and you are an energy software engineer, and you're teaching a class that is called Introduction to Software for Battery Systems. So maybe you can tell us what's happening with batteries and software in Seattle.
Yeah. Well, let me first give you a little bit of my background, which is, I started off as a physicist. So I got my PhD in applied physics from Stanford doing solar energy research, kind of in the material science side.
Oh, wow.
My advisor, Richard Swanson, went out and founded the company SunPower.
Oh, really? So you know Richard Swanson?
Yeah. He was my graduate school advisor.
He has a law named after him. I'm sure you know all about Swanson's law.
Right, which I heard he did not actually come up with, and he'll be very honest about it. Someone else came up with it.
He sounds like a modest guy and he's not claiming ownership of it, but I think what happened is he noticed that with technology, every time you like double it, the price goes down by a certain amount. And so it goes something like every time the amount of solar installed in the world doubles, the price of solar goes down by 20%. Does that sound right?
That sounds about right. It's been a little while since I looked at it, but that sounds about right. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of people kind of compared it to Moore's Law, because with Moore's Law, you have this doubling rate of something like 18 months or 2 years, where you can essentially fit twice as much on a computer chip, which makes it faster because those electrons don't have to go as far and that darn speed of light gets in the way.
Right.
And then it operates cooler and more efficient. And I'm not sure if Moore's Law is still happening, but from all I've heard, it still is. Do you know about that?
I think it is. I'd have to look. It's been a while since I looked at it, but I think they keep thinking, oh, we're running to the limit. We can't possibly make it smaller. And then somehow they figure out a way to make it smaller. Yeah, it also impacts the price, right? Because,
Yeah.
the more things you can cram on a wafer, the cheaper it's going to be, which is not true for solar, unfortunately, right? I mean, you're limited. You can increase the efficiency some, but obviously not the kind of way that you can for computer chips.
Yeah, we're limited by people like you with physics, you and your
Right,
physics
exactly.
slowing us down.
Absolutely.
We don't want to have to deal with thermodynamics. We want to have 200% efficiency, like the heat pump people. They're always telling us that they can have 300% efficient heat pumps.
Right. Well, anyway, to get off solar, because eventually, like many physicists, I ended up in software, and I was doing software for many years as a commercial software developer, and also involved in writing and teaching about it. And then at some point in my career, I just thought, I really miss being in energy. And is there some way I could use my software skills and get back into renewable energy in some way? And I talked to a lot of people and eventually managed to get a job at a company that basically operated, utility scale batteries for various systems. Originally, they were just essentially putting these in systems that used a lot of energy. So these are factories and data centers and sometimes campuses or giant apartment buildings. And they may or may not have something like solar attached to it. And those are what are referred to as behind the meter systems, right? So you have an electricity meter and the battery is on the same side of that electricity meter as whatever's using the energy. And so when I joined, they were just starting to look at what they call in front of the meter, which is you put the batteries near the energy generators, the solar and wind farms, for example. And so I worked on that for quite a bit. I worked a bit on both, but I just found that learning about how software and batteries combine was like a really fascinating thing that, unlike, a solar panel, you can, if you've got some DC device, you can just hook it up and it'll work, right? But with batteries, you need software. You need software to figure out when are you going to charge this thing up and when you're going to discharge that energy and use it. And so it's a really interesting problem to try to understand how do you build a system that does that.
That's all very interesting. So it's also interesting too that you start off with physics, and then you said that everybody in physics gets into software, but I think that might have something to do with going to Stanford, which is pretty much in the middle of Silicon Valley.
Right, right.
Like other people might say, everybody that went to Stanford gets into software. And so you're not doing physics anymore. So when did you stop believing in physics?
I'm not sure I stopped believing in it, but as I said, it was hard to. Essentially, what happened is after I graduated, I came to Seattle to work for Boeing. Boeing had essentially a space solar cell program.
Oh, cool.
And so they were working on that. And then Boeing's funny, they go through these cycles where they say, hey, the only thing we know how to do is make airplanes. We have to diversify, and they'll get into all kinds of things. And then 10 years later, they'll say, the only thing we're good at is making airplanes. Let's get rid of all this other stuff we're doing. And so they kind of go through these cycles. So they were doing a bunch of electronics research, and solar was one of them. And then they decided.
So were you working at Spectre Lab, the Boeing solar cell company?
No, this was before they bought Spectralab. We had our own, what was called the High Tech Center, where we were building these things. And then they shut that down. And then, as they say, it's a cycle. So sometime later, a few years later, they were like, oh, no, we do want to be in solar. And they had completely shut down the lab that I was in and bought Spectralab.
So, well, it's nice to have a few extra $1 billion laying around. So what kind of solar technology were you doing for Boeing before Spectralab? And I believe Spectralab does gallium arsenide a lot, and they have, pictures of stuff on their website, 30% efficient and even perhaps 40% efficient with like multi-junction concentrated solar.
Yes, we were doing essentially that, multi-junction concentrated solar. We were doing it with the junctions was actually, I think it's slightly different than how Spectralab does it. But we had two solar cells, one of gallium arsenide, and that converted the visible. But then there was grids on both the front and the back, and that it passed the light through to a bottom cell, which was made of gallium antimonide. And that
Gallium antimonide, I don't even know about that one.
Yeah, and that took the infrared, and that was actually my specialty. I was working on the gallium antimonide cell.
What is it, if you can explain that I could understand?
Well, it's a 3,5 material, right? So gallium arsenide is gallium and arsenic, right? And to forming a lattice together, a crystal. And this was gallium and arsenic together to form a crystal. Yeah.
Yeah, I put that on my breakfast cereal.
Yeah, right, exactly. So yeah, we had to.
What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right?
I know, I had to be tested for arsenic regularly. So yeah, but it was fascinating work. And we also had stuff in the kind of low 30s efficiency going on for space application.
I've always wondered about that too. So it's up in space, it's multi-junction, and it's concentrated. A lot of times concentrated, they talk about like 300 suns or something like that.
Right.
So how does that apply to space? Are they like focusing a big lens or reflectors onto a little piece of solar cell?
Yes.
Up in space?
Yes, basically that's right. They have like a Fresnel lens usually, that focuses it down.
Is any of the stuff you were working on still up there?
No, we did put some stuff up there for testing purposes, but we never got past that. And so I don't think, it's an expensive solution to have twice as many, solar cells. It's a lot of the multi-junction stuff they now do by putting down different layers, and that's more cost effective.
I think that's pretty cool that you're an astronaut.
Yeah, it was a very cool thing to get something I worked on actually up in space, even though it was just a test, and I think it was only up there for a fairly short time.
Okay.
It was great.
Well, all of that stuff sounds very interesting. And now you're doing software. So Making the move from physics, solar cells into software, how does that happen? Do you just take a Python class like I did?
I did. Well, I was working at Boeing and they were shutting down this thing, and I just was looking for other jobs at Boeing because the economy was not great at that time. And there was an opening in an automation robotics group. And so I had taken a class, I think at that time on C and C++. Those were the popular languages because this was
Oh,
what. And this group, automation
Is
robotics,
that
did.
what grades you got in Stanford? But you had to get
Yeah.
A's to get into it, and once you're there, it's like C++
Once you're there, yeah, you just don't worry about
is
it,
all
right?
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not like they're going to kick you out. No.
No, grades are not, yeah, graduate school, not so much. But yeah, I did that. I did some various software projects. I was working on some of the first augmented reality projects that were going on at Boeing. And then, yeah, just from there to some startups. And then, yeah, I got a little bit more into writing and teaching, but I was doing coding all along. And I always liked doing stuff that involved a little bit of, physics in some way. I was at some point developing a mobile app for a thermometer, basically a temperature probe that people were looking to see how the permafrost was doing up in the Arctic Circle. So, that was a super fun project to figure out, like, okay, how do you get this temperature data out in Bluetooth? Because you don't want somebody taking off their gloves to plug in something, into your remote center. So it had to be this Bluetooth thing. Yeah, yeah. So I definitely enjoy working in software. I like the sort of problem solving that you get to do.
So you took the Earth's temperature, and did you learn anything from that data? Is the planet heating up?
So I think what I heard, this was a contract for a company, and their two main customers were scientists trying to learn, what was going on up in the Arctic Circle, and oil and gas companies who wanted to build on the permafrost and didn't want it suddenly melting out from under them. So it was definitely two clients at odds with each other.
That's kind of weird because they're oil companies and they don't want the permafrost to melt, but they might be causing it to melt.
Yes, that
They're
is
kind of
kind of
working
how it
against
works.
themselves.
Yeah, yeah. This is true.
I have heard of that where buildings don't stand up
Hmm.
because of permafrost and
Right,
roads don't
right.
work right and things like that. Yeah. Well, very interesting.
Yeah. Well, maybe I can tell you a bit about the course because it's been really fun to
Yeah, for
work on.
sure. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I found fascinating when I worked for Enel and then another company, Calibrant Energy, was that, we turn on our light switch and we get electricity, and we don't really know exactly how we get it. But there's this whole energy market, right? It's kind of like the stock market. And if you're generating energy, you're bidding into it. And if you are consuming energy, your utility, then you're also bidding into it. And there are these independent service operators, ISOs, that match up, the
Yeah,
bids coming
like
in
I
to
guess like
generate.
Cal ISO, things like that.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah. So yeah, ISO and yeah, and so it's fascinating. So I was working with ERCOT, which is the Energy Reliability Council of Texas. So they're the operator in Texas, and
So would you call ERCOT an ISO then?
yeah, yes, I believe they call it that. Texas has to be a little bit different because they're Texas and they have a much less regulated market. So it was fascinating to work in that market. Yeah, and so I had to learn when we're sending energy in from the battery, you have to bid in, and when you're taking it out, you have to bid as well. And so it was kind of fascinating to just learn how all that worked.
I would like to learn more about how all of that works too with all these energy markets. And, I guess it's really complicated. They're regulated, they're probably all different. And then
They
you
are.
have things like virtual power plants getting in
Yes.
on it. And they need the virtual power plants because the grid needs it. But also it's kind of ceding control a little bit, perhaps.
Seating control, you mean the market seating control to the
Well,
virtual power plant?
yeah, like the people that are in charge of electricity are now letting regular consumers, take electricity and send it back to the grid and back and forth, I guess you could say, when you're talking about energy storage.
Right, right. Yeah, and I did work on virtual power plants, but not from the consumer. It's again these batteries that are put with the energy users. You can coordinate a bunch of those and create a virtual power plant. And so I think the utilities are comfortable with that, or I should say the markets are comfortable with that. But then when you have it be everybody's electric vehicles that are taking, charging and discharging into the market, it's more complicated. And I think they're still trying to figure that piece out. But yeah, it's interesting. The other thing that I learned is that with batteries, you can bid not only the energy that you sell, but you can bid a sort of reserve. You can say, hey, I'll have a bunch of energy in reserve. If you need it, just send me a signal and I'll send it to you. And you get paid whether that energy is used or not. So that's an interesting way, and apparently that can be quite profitable to just sell your energy in reserve. And along those lines, another thing like that is the frequency response. So the idea is that, if you suddenly get extra load on your system, the frequency of the alternating current will drop. And so you can essentially be paid to watch that frequency. And if you're a battery, if it drops too low, you suddenly start putting energy in and you bring that frequency back up. So you can get paid for doing that. So there's kind of these interesting ways to get paid beyond just selling energy.
I just thought of an analogy for what you were talking about, frequency response. If you have one of those old, dirty internal combustion cars and you're driving towards a hill and you have your foot on the gas and you're on a flat land and then you go towards the hill, the engine will start going slower until you push on that gas pedal to compensate.
Yes, it's very, very similar to that. And it's the fact that so much of our power is generated through turbines that this is true, right? So if you suddenly have more load on the generator, it sort of takes more force to keep it spinning, and that slows it down. As we move towards solar, that actually becomes less of a problem, right? Because solar does not have those turbines. If you suddenly increase the load on solar, you don't get this change in the frequency.
Well, the sun does spin though, but it's really far away.
Right. This is true. That would be entertaining if the Earth suddenly, sped up or slowed down, depending on how much power you use.
Isn't that a coincidence? The Earth and the sun both spin. Wow.
Yeah. No, but your analogy is correct. So anyway, those are the sort of things I talk about in the course, is thinking about the energy markets, or if you're a behind the meter system, then you need to be predicting your energy use. So, if for a residence, right, we get charged for the amount of energy we use. But if you are a commercial space of any kind, you get charged for not just the energy, but the power, the maximum power that you use.
Demand charge. I always thought demand charges, it's kind of strange too, that they decide to just say whatever's the most you use all month. Like, why did they pick a month, not a day, not a week,
right,
or something else, or like every time the sun spins, whatever.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, and I don't know if that's consistent or not, that it's always a month, but it's true. It's like some period of time.
Yeah, I always hear it being a month, and then
That could be.
they do even have it for residential. It's not as common, but I know over in Arizona they're doing it, in Southern California they're doing it. And it makes it more difficult for solar, but it's really good for storage.
Right. So for storage, what you do is you try to predict your usage, right? And if you know you're going to be going above that peak that you've already done for the month, then you try to store up energy beforehand and use it during that peak. And the name for that is peak shaving. So it's a way to lower that demand cost by, anticipating that.
So it's sort of like shaving off the head of the duck on the duck curve.
Kind of, yes, you're right. That is a slightly disturbing but accurate analogy. Yeah,
Sorry, ducks.
Well, the last thing I'll mention is that, and this idea came from the heat spring folks, was the idea that to show that you could use AI as a way to generate the code that you would use for this kind of thing. And a lot of what you do when you write software for these systems is build simulators, because you don't want to test things out on the real batteries, right? You want to test them out on your simulators first. So in the course, I show how you can do AI to build a very simple battery simulator. And my goal is to do some more follow-on classes that would really use AI and build much more sophisticated system to show like a behind-the-meter system and in front of the meter system.
Great. Yeah, all that stuff sounds super, super important, trying to coordinate all that kind of stuff. And I think that your class would be super, super important for people to understand, especially people that are making these decisions. Maybe we should make it so everybody that works at an ISO has to take your class, and everybody, ERCOT, if that's a Texas version of an ISO, they have to take your class. And I think that all the politicians should have to take your class.
Right.
Who else should have to take your class?
Well, it's funny. I feel like I wrote it partly for people like myself, right? I came in not really knowing anything about energy. I just knew how to code. And it was quite a learning curve to just understand what these systems are and what they do. So I definitely feel like, yes, the more technical folks need it. But yes, also the more kind of higher level folks, the decision makers, I think that is smart that they understand all the different pieces and what batteries can do for the grid, basically.
We interrupt you for a very important announcement. Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast has been brought to you by Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. That's right, Sean White is sponsoring his own podcast, and he wants to remind you to go check out some of his classes. You can go to SolarSEAN, that's Solar, SEAN.com, and then click on the links to check out his classes. You can check out his heat spring classes, and you can also hire him to teach classes for you, like at your company, something like that. Now back to the show.
So you know how to code. Do you write with different programs?
Yeah, so the last job that I did, I was working with Java primarily, because it's just a very popular language and that's, kind of what people used. It made it easy to interact with the battery systems because there were libraries in place for that. So the majority was Java, but there were also a lot of Python. Python's used in anything that's got, data analysis of any kind. So things like optimization or forecasting, that's all done in Python. So it was a bit of Python, a lot of Java. This class, though, I find Python is a good programming language for this because it's an easy language for getting things started. And it's, as I say, good for things like data analysis and visualization and things like that.
So maybe you could even mention a little bit more too. So you are a senior software engineer at SDK Bridge, and it looks like you've been there for quite a while. And what is SDK Bridge? I guess it's something that not your average person knows about, but
Right.
maybe it's behind, like everybody uses it every day, perhaps.
Right. So SDK Bridge is actually my own company. And so that's why I've been there for a long time and I've done a variety of different things with it. SDK originally stood for Software Development Kit. And I created the company to basically explain these software development kits, which were, essentially the building blocks, the sort of libraries that you use to build software. There aren't that many folks who can code and who can write well. So that was kind of the niche of the company. The SDK work eventually became API, Application Programming Interface. We did a lot of what are called web APIs, documenting them, explaining how they worked. But now that I'm gotten into this energy space, I'm calling it, it can be solar or storage and then development knowledge. So that's kind of my educational side of what I do, is just trying to get across, teach basically what I've learned about software and renewable energy.
Great, great. So I think everybody should take your class, and it's actually no cost, right?
Yes.
Introduction to Software for Battery Systems. Build a solid understanding of how software controls battery operations, enables market participation, and maximizes economic value and utility scale deployments. And you've got 54 students and you have 5.0 stars. You have more stars than I do as far as your average. Maybe I'll have to do something about that. No, well, congratulations. That is very good, getting 5.0 stars. So your class must be excellent. I think everybody should take your class.
Oh, thanks. And and it's fairly newly out there. So I think that's why the number of students is still a little bit low. But the feedback we've been getting has actually been, as you say, very, very positive. So that's been very
Well, you're just getting started. So that's good for when you're getting started. When I got started, I also had a point in time when I had 54 students. And now I'm getting 40 something thousand. I don't know.
Wow, that's impressive. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's been quite a while. So,
Right.
But yeah, so welcome to Heat Spring. I'm really glad to be teaching with you on Heat Spring, and hopefully I'll meet you in person sometime. And I think there's a lot of different subjects that you know about that are very interesting. And I would like to talk to you again sometime on the podcast, and maybe we could talk again.
Yes, that'd be great. Yeah, I really enjoyed talking to you, and it's great just to talk to a fellow Heat Spring instructor here.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Peter Gruenbaum, president of SDK Bridge. And thanks for listening to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. To learn more, go to SolarSEAN.com and you can go there and learn about all of my heat spring classes. You can hire me to come and teach a class in person. Maybe we could talk Peter into coming and joining us and teaching a class in person. And you can get yourself NABCEP certified with the least amount of pain, because my classes are fun, and I'm sure Peter's are too, because he has a 5.0 average rating. I've never seen that on Amazon or anywhere. So congratulations, Peter. And it was great talking to you.
Yeah, great talking to you too. Thanks for doing this, Sean.
All right. Woo.